What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to build this really clean, simple, modern, either hat rack or coat rack. This is another project in the series of projects I'm doing with Lowe's Home Improvement. So this was another kind of limited tools build, really easy to build, but I absolutely love the way it came out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the project.
The first step in this project was to create the template for the hangers on the coat rack. And I used 3/4 inch plywood for this, although 1/2 inch would have been even better. To draw the curve, I drove in 3 screws, 1 at each end and 1 in the center of the board, and bent a scrap piece of plastic to make the curve. And after marking out all the lines, I could cut to the lines using the jigsaw, and I made sure to stay slightly proud of the lines so I could sand flush to them later on. Also, I do have plans, including a template for laying out the shape of the hooks, available on my website in case you're interested in building one of these racks for yourself. Once I had the shape rough cut, I moved over to the oscillating belt sander and refined the shape, smoothing out the curve and flattening the straight areas. And I also went ahead and slightly rounded those pointy corners so that would transfer to the final hooks. Next, I transferred the shape, tracing around the template onto an oak 1x3 and started rough cutting the actual hooks with the jigsaw. And it was extremely important that I stayed away from my lines here, as I'd need some overhang to be able to use the flush trim bit on the router in the next step. And by nesting the hooks on the board, I was able to get 5 hooks out of each 1x3x8, and it's also much easier to cut out the shapes if you leave them all as one board as you work, so that you can clamp the board in place. And a bandsaw also would work really well for this task. Next, using some double stick tape, I attached the template to one of the hooks, and then could start routing the hook flush with the template. And I left way too much extra material on this first hook. You really only want to be about 1/8 of an inch proud of the template, especially on those ends of the hooks, which are really prone to tear out. Also, this bit I'm using is the monstrous ultimate flush trim bit from Whiteside, and you really need to use the starter pin with this bit, which I installed after remembering that. And the pin allows you to pivot into the bit, which helps to control the workpiece without the bit pulling the piece out of your hands. Once everything was flushed up, I popped off the template and was left with basically a perfect hook, save for a little bit of tear out because I had too much overhang. After getting the hang of the process on the first piece, I could repeat the process 5 more times, and actually I built 2 of these racks, so I had to repeat the process 11 more times. And this flush trim bit left a surprisingly smooth surface, and I really just needed to clean it up slightly, which I did again over at the belt sander. I went straight to 180 grit to avoid removing too much material and changing the shape of the hooks too much. I also sanded the faces of the hooks up to 120 grit off camera, and then added an 1/8 inch radius roundover to all the edges of the hooks, except for the flat back edge, which would be glued to the backer board later on. And speaking of the backer board, next I could start cutting those pieces to size. And I used this process of additive joinery again on this project and cut a number of smaller spacer blocks to go in between the hooks, all of which would be assembled on top of one longer backer board. And a stop block on the miter saw really makes this process a lot quicker and simpler. With all the pieces cut to size, I could start assembling the backer board. First, I lined up one of the smaller spacer blocks with one end of the back, used a square to make sure it was square to the board, and then used brad nails and glue to attach the block. Next, using one of the hooks as a spacer, I added the next spacer block, again checking for square, and then attaching it again with glue and brad nails. I just kept repeating the process along the entire length of the board until I got to the end.
All right, while I finish assembling, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Lowe's Home Improvement, and the tool of this week, this 4-piece set from Cobalt. It includes this drill driver, impact driver, reciprocating saw, and flashlight, and I've also added a couple more pieces for this project, the jigsaw and the sander. And these are a great beginner set of tools to build most projects. One other thing I might add to this lineup would be a circular saw, which obviously you could add as well. But these Cobalt tools have been great. It's an awesome balance of value and performance. They're super simple to use and have some great features. This drill has 2 different speeds, a bunch of different clutch settings, and a built-in LED light. This impact driver has 3 different speeds, including a delicate screw setting, which is great for driving those little fragile screws. This reciprocating saw will obviously cut through anything, great for demo work, and this whole set runs on Cobalt's 24-volt platform, which lasts a really long time. I didn't even have to charge my batteries at all during this project, which I think is really saying something. So if you guys want to learn more about this set, check out the link in the video description below. Thanks again to the folks at Lowe's for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and get back to it.
Once everything was assembled, I added some oak-colored wood filler to cover up those nail holes and let it dry. Next, I sanded everything flush, both the wood filler and the top and bottom edges. Once everything was sanded, I marked a line to indicate where I wanted to cut a 30-degree bevel on each end of the back. With the angle cut, I moved on to knocking down all of those sharp edges with my block plane, and then got everything sanded up to 180 grit. The last step before gluing the hooks onto the back was to install these keyhole hangers, which is how these racks will be hung on the wall. And you can surface mount these hangers, but I personally think they look a lot better if you recess them so the piece sits flush with the wall. I spaced the hangers 16 inches on center to line up with the studs, centered them vertically on the back of the rack, and then traced a line around the outside edge. I used a 1/2 inch Forstner bit to drill out the majority of the area, and then cleaned it up with a chisel. I also needed to drill a little bit deeper in the center section to accept the screw head, which is when my camera died. Finally, I used a self-centering drill bit to pre-drill the holes to attach the hanger, and then drove in the screws. And you can see how the screw head sits in the keyhole hanger. This is upside down, but I think you get the idea. With that, I could finally move on to gluing in the hooks, which required a little bit of forethought. Of course, I wanted all of the hooks to line up correctly, and this is what I came up with to make that happen. First, I clamped the back piece square to the edge of my workbench, and then clamped a T-square to the bench with a flat piece of wood flush with that square. And with this setup, I could add some glue to the joint, put the hook in place, and make sure the top end of the hook lined up with that board. I placed all the hooks, allowing the glue to become a little bit tacky for a few minutes before going back and adding clamps. And here's a couple more angles of the setup in case you're wanting to build this as well. Finally, I sanded the whole thing up to 180 grit, making sure to remove any glue squeeze out, and then applied 3 coats of Minwax polyacrylic using the spray can version. And I really didn't want to darken the color of this red oak anymore, and polyacrylic barely changes to the color of the wood, so it was perfect for the look I was going for here. Once the finish dried, I reinstalled the keyhole hangers, added my stamp and the date to the back, and then hung it on the wall by driving in a couple 2.5 inch screws into the studs. And with that, this project was done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy with the way this hat rack came out. This one was more out of necessity than anything. I wear a lot of hats, and now that we're going into winter, obviously coats are something we are using every day. So having a good, cool looking place to put our coats and hats is gonna be really nice. So again, I do have plans available for this project if you wanna check that out. It's got a template so that you can create the pattern for this hook. I think that was probably the most challenging part of this build, really, because you want all these hooks to look identical, and without template routing, flush trim routing, I really think that's a little bit trickier. You could do it with something like a belt sander and tape all the pieces together if you don't have a router, so don't let that deter you, but having a router definitely makes things a lot easier. So thanks again to Lowe's for sponsoring this project. I do have links to all the tools and materials I used, all of which were from Lowe's, in the video description below. Also, if this is your first time to the channel, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this pretty much every week. Also ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. And last, I do have that YouTube member feature turned on the channel. You get all kinds of cool perks, behind the scenes content, and I'm gonna start throwing some free plans to my members as well. So hopefully you guys can check that out. It helps to support me, and it's just a fun way to kind of interact behind the scenes with you guys. So thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next week, happy building.